I'm Roberta, and I've worked at my parents' tableware business for as long as I can remember. We carry a wide range of items, from elegant dinner plates to coffee mugs for the morning. This is a family-run company at its core. Everything was normal that day until Mrs. Wilson, the owner of the bakery next door, barged into our store. That's when things started to shift. She entered the room as if she were the owner. Not even stepping foot inside the store, she yelled, "John, I need to talk to you right now." Her voice has the power to cut through concrete. I took a moment to observe the scene while I was rearranging some ceramic teapots we had recently acquired. Dad gave me a look like, "Here we go again," and wiped his hands on his apron. "That's right, Beverly. What's agitating?" Dad usually attempted to be happy when she was around, but you could sense him getting ready. Mrs. Wilson finally looked at me as she looked about. "Roberta, this is a family business. Would you mind waiting a minute?" I took offense at her tone, but I ignored it and moved to the opposite side of the shop, feigning to straighten out a dining set display that was already flawless. Their voices rang out through the shelves, not that I was attempting to listen in. "John, let me get right to the point. Your business and my bakery have long been neighbors. We need to expand our thinking. How do you feel about our firms merging?" Her tone was solemn and businesslike. Dad gave a little surprised cough. "Merge, really? Beverly, that is a really suggested. What's this notion that you have right now?" She went on, lowering her voice till I had to struggle to hear her. "Not just that," she said. "I believe our children could further benefit from this. A marriage between Roberta and Lucas would seal the deal." I nearly knocked over a teapot. "Lucas? Mary?" The Lucas I knew was her son, yes, but he was 10 years older than I was, and even though we lived next door, we hardly spoke at all. I glanced down the aisle and noticed Dad scratching his head, obviously thinking. At last, Dad said, "Lucas is a good lad, and Roberta's a brilliant girl, but marriage? Seldom do they know one another. They'll get along, Beverly, believe me. Furthermore, doesn't it make sound commercial sense?" Her tone had a sarcasm that suggested she was accustomed to having her way. Dad slowly nodded. "I'll talk it over with the missus and Roberta, of course." Dad summoned me over after Mrs. Wilson departed. "Roberta, you heard all that, didn't you?" I nodded, unsure of how to interpret it. "She wants to merge the store and the bakery, and she wants me to marry Lucas." "Yeah," Dad said, massaging his temples. "What do you think?" I realize it's a lot to process. I'd never thought about getting married for work, and it sounded like something from a movie. "Dad, I have no idea. Is it really wise to marry Lucas on his first impressions? This time, meet him properly and see if the two of you click. There's no rush to make a decision. We'll approach this cautiously." Over the following few months, Lucas and I got to know one another. He was not just well-mannered, but I discovered that he had a real side to him that cared about the company just as much as his mother did, but less controllingly. We frequently had personal talks instead of commercial ones, which gave the impression that we were developing a possible relationship rather than entering into a contract. But the wedding planning was a different story. Everything was taken over by my soon-to-be mother-in-law, Mrs. Wilson. The decorations looked like they belonged in one of her display windows, and the cake was from her bakery. She stormed into the room one afternoon when we were reviewing the guest list, carrying so many invitations that it looked like we were calling the entire town. "Roberta, please add a few names to your guest list. These are people who are significant to our company." She said, "It's imperative they're there." And with a thud that made me jump, she dropped the stack on the table. I bit my tongue so as not to provoke a quarrel. Lucas felt my hand beneath the table as soon as he noticed this. "Robbie, we'll work things out. Remember that today is our day?" The wedding day passed like a haze. Feeling less like a bride and more like a prop in Mrs. Wilson's elaborate business plan, I stood at the rear of the hall wearing my dress. With a slightly strained smile, My dad approached me. "You appear stunning, Roberta." He held out his arm and asked, "Are you ready?" I took a big breath and nodded. "Let's do this." The ceremony flew by, and before I knew it, Lucas and I were given our marital status. The event was packed with Mrs. Wilson's guests, who spoke more about our joint enterprises than our wedding. It was quite noisy. The union was finalized shortly after the nuptials. The two stores were combined into one large area, with one area designated for the tableware and the other for the bread. Mrs. Wilson was everywhere on the first day we opened the merged store, commanding employees like a general. "Roberta, please check that the dishes match the pastries." "Symmetry is a selling point," she yelled over the shop. I tried to meet her strict requirements as I rearranged the plates. Lucas was attempting to arrange with the bakers in the bakery department. Verify the freshness of those scones. Over the din, he yelled, "Roberta, how's it going over there?" "Attempting to adhere to your mother's symmetry motto," I yelled in response, a tinge of annoyance in my tone. But the task only increased as the weeks stretched into months. I was unable to attend my college studies because of managing the store's front, helping in the bakery, and all the paperwork. "Roberta, you are now operating a business. That degree won't be necessary." One evening, Mrs. Wilson said in a tone that suggested the issue was already resolved, "This is your life." Her final cutting remarks struck me more deeply than I had anticipated. It was intended to save us money and simplify corporate management by letting us live with them. We were only a short walk from the store, so it simply meant that I would be working longer hours. Every day was more difficult than the last because of Mrs. Wilson's relentless supervision and lack of personal space. What had begun as a collaboration began to feel more and more like a takeover. Meanwhile, I noticed something else that troubled me more than I expected. My dad was around less and less. One particularly busy Tuesday morning, as I was setting up the store before opening, I couldn't help but feel the emptiness of his absence. It used to be that he'd be here by now, sharing a joke or two to kick off the day. Instead, it was just me and the clinking of ceramics. That evening, after a long day of dealing with customers and Mrs. Wilson's incessant directions, I visited my parents. The air in their living room felt heavier than usual, like there were words hanging in it that no one dared to speak. "Dad, why aren't you at the store much anymore?" I asked as soon as I sat down. The direct approach felt necessary. My dad looked up, a frown creasing his forehead. "Well, Roberta, it's complicated. Beverly she's taken over more than we expected." My mom chimed in from across the room, her voice sharp with worry. "She's pushed your father out." "Roberta, that contract we signed, it wasn't just a merger. It's like we handed her the keys to the kingdom." My stomach twisted into knots. "What do you mean, Dad? You've always handled the orders and the suppliers." He sighed, his hands clasped tightly together. "Not anymore. Beverly rewrote the job roles legally. I'm just a consultant now, barely that. I don't have a say in the business I built." Anger flared up inside me, hot and fierce. "Why didn't you say anything?" "We thought we could handle it, sort it out without worrying you," my mom said, her eyes sad. "But it's clear we can't. She's taking everything we've worked for." The next day I confronted Mrs. Wilson. It was early, just as the morning light began spilling into the store. She was arranging some pastries, her back to me as I walked in. "Mrs. Wilson, we need to talk about my dad," I said, my voice firm, louder than I intended. She turned around, her expression one of mock surprise. "Oh, what about him, dear?" "You know what I'm talking about. You're pushing him out of his own business." "Why are you doing this?" I demanded. Mrs. Wilson straightened up, wiping her hands on her apron as she faced me. "Roberta, your father is getting older. He can't handle the stress of the business. It's better for everyone this way. I'm making things more efficient." "That's not your call to make," I shot back. He built this place. You can't just sideline him because you think it's better. She scoffed, shaking her head. Business is tough, Roberta. It's not about sentimental value. It's about keeping the ship afloat. I'm doing what's necessary. When the pandemic hit, it felt like someone had pulled the floor out from under us. Sales at the store plummeted. Every day the empty aisles stared back at me, a grim reminder that things were bad and might get worse. It was during one of those quiet, worrying shifts that I decided we couldn't just sit around waiting for normal to return. Lucas, we have to pivot to online. We can set up delivery, maybe start taking individual orders, I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Lucas looked skeptical, but nodded. It's worth a shot. Let's talk to Mom about it. I knew convincing Mrs. Wilson would be an uphill battle. She had her way set in stone and viewed online sales as a risky venture. True to form, when we brought it up, she dismissed it outright. We're not some tech startup, we're a brick-and-mortar business. We'll wait this out, she declared, cutting off any further discussion. But I couldn't just stand by and watch everything we'd built crumble to dust. So I started something on the down low, after hours. I used our store's resources to build an online community. I sold dishes from the store and took to baking cakes after the bakery closed for the day. Orders began to trickle in, then flood. Keeping this from Lucas and Mrs. Wilson was exhausting. I was burning the candle at both ends, managing our secret online sales and my day job at the store. Nights turned into mornings, and I found myself sneaking back home well past midnight on many occasions. One night, as I tiptoed in, trying not to wake anyone, I found Mrs. Wilson waiting in the living room, her arms folded, and her face a mix of anger and disappointment. "Where have you been, Roberta?" "Look at the state of this house," she snapped, her voice low but fierce. "I've been working, Mrs. Wilson. We got a rush of online orders tonight," I replied, my voice weary from too many long nights. "Online orders? What online orders?" Her voice rose, sharp and accusing. Before I could explain, Lucas came down, drawn by the noise. "Mom, what's going on?" "Ask your wife what's going on. She's running some secret side business and neglecting her duties around here," Mrs. Wilson shot back, glaring at me. Lucas turned to me, confusion and frustration written all over his face. "What's she talking about?" I sighed, the fatigue of the last few weeks catching up to me. "I started an online store. It's been keeping us afloat since the pandemic started. I didn't tell you because your mom said no, and I didn't think she'd go for it." Lucas rubbed his temples, looking between his mom and me. "You should have told me, Roberta. And you," he turned to his mom, "should have been more open to her ideas." Mrs. Wilson's face hardened. "This is my house, and while you're under my roof, you'll follow my rules, both of you." The argument spiraled from there. Lucas, usually my ally, sided with his mom this time. "Roberta, you need to balance your time better. Help out more around here." Defeated and heartbroken that Lucas didn't see how hard I was trying to save our business, I cut back on the online orders. I started spending my mornings cleaning the house instead of preparing shipments or baking. My afternoons were spent running the pastry counter, a reminder of what I had to scale back on to keep peace in the house. It was a dreary, rain-soaked afternoon when I was straightening up the store hall. The door creaked open, and a little girl, about 8 years old, stumbled in. Her clothes were drenched, sticking to her skin, and she was crying, her face streaked with tears. I rushed over to her, setting aside the stack of plates I was arranging. "Hey there, what happened? Are you okay?" I asked, trying to sound as gentle as I could. Before she could answer, Mrs. Wilson spotted us from the end of the aisle. She marched over, her lips pressed into a thin line. "What is this, Roberta? We don't have time for this today. She looks like a beggar. Put her out before others see." My stomach twisted at her words. She's just a child, Mrs. Wilson. She's clearly lost and needs help. Lucas came over, having overheard his mother. His face was unreadable as he glanced at the girl, then back at me. Roberta, Mom's right. We can't have kids like her running into the store. It's not good for business. Just handle it, okay? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Lucas, she's scared and alone. We can't just throw her back out into the rain. Ignoring them both, I took the girl to a chair and wrapped her in a clean blanket from the back room. I made her a cup of hot chocolate, hoping to calm her down a bit. Mrs. Wilson was fuming. This is exactly the kind of distraction we don't need. Roberta, you're responsible for any fallout from this. The girl managed to calm down enough to tell me her name was Sophie. She had wandered off from a park nearby and gotten lost. Just as she started to relax, the police arrived. They thanked me for looking after Sophie and told me her parents had been frantically looking for her. Turns out she wasn't far from home after all. After the police and Sophie left, Mrs. Wilson pulled me aside, her face stern and cold. Because of your little stunt, I'm fining you. You took time away from your work to deal with this situation. You'll wash dishes for the next 2 days to make up for it. Lucas just nodded along with whatever his mom said, not one standing up for me. It stung more than I expected. That night, as I scrubbed pot after pot, my mind raced. I felt more like a servant than a part of the family. Lucas's support had always been my rock, but now he was just another weight dragging me down. Each harsh word from Mrs. Wilson, each nod of agreement from Lucas, was a reminder of how trapped I felt. It was another ordinary morning at the store when a richly dressed man walked in, looking around like he was searching for something special. I greeted him and asked if I could help him find anything. He nodded and explained he was looking for a high-end tea set. I showed him our finest collection, and he seemed impressed, selecting one of our most expensive sets. While I wrapped up his purchase, he browsed our pastry section and picked out an assortment of treats. The whole time, he had this kind demeanor about him, making small talk and asking about the store's history. After ringing up his purchases, he thanked me and then paused, his expression turning a bit more serious. By the way, I'm not sure if you remember, but my daughter was the little girl you helped out last week, the one who got lost in the storm. I was taken aback, not expecting this twist. Of course I remember. She was such a brave little girl. I'm glad I could help her. He smiled warmly and handed me his business card. Well, I'm really grateful for what you did. If you ever need anything, advice or help with anything at all, just give me a call. I looked at the card and noticed he was a lawyer, Mr. Hayes. That caught my attention, considering the mess with the store and the merger. Actually, there might be something. Could we maybe talk about a legal matter? It's about the business my father used to own with my mother-in-law. Of course, he replied with an encouraging nod. Why don't you come by my office next week? We can go over everything in detail. I took him up on his offer, feeling a mix of relief and anxiety. At his office, I handed him the pile of documents my dad had signed years ago, the ones that merged our family store with my mother-in-law's bakery. He went through them carefully, his brow furrowing more with each page. After a long silence, Mr. Hayes looked up. There are several significant issues here. The contract has multiple violations that are quite concerning. I think we have a strong case if you want to challenge this. He offered to help me pro bono to make things right. I was overwhelmed but grateful. Thank you. It's just hard, you know. It's my husband's family, too. He understood my hesitation. It's not just about business. It's about your life. You deserve to have control over that, and you're not alone in this fight. I left his office feeling a mix of hope and dread. Could I really go against my husband and his mother? But then, what was the alternative? Living under Mrs. Wilson's thumb? watching the store my parents built from scratch being mismanaged? That evening, my head was still spinning from the meeting with the lawyer when I entered our home. I was unprepared for the sight that met my eyes. The place was lively, with people chatting, laughing, and clinking glasses. I stopped to process everything. I was spotted by my slightly inebriated mother-in-law, who yelled, "There you are, wandering the streets when you should be here serving your guests," across the room. "Roberta, it's your anniversary. Do you not feel obligated?" I became motionless. Amid the turmoil of recent events, I had entirely forgotten about my anniversary. I stammered, feeling as though everyone in the room was staring at me. "I'm sorry, I forgot." Nothing about my apology made her feel better. She took a neighboring pizza box and threw it at me out of rage. The package skimmed my shoulder and fell to the floor. "Used, completely pointless," she exclaimed, her cheeks flushed with rage. Before I could get better, Lucas staggered over to me, obviously drunk as well. "You don't even appear to be hungry." He slurred and mockingly threw wine from his glass into my hands and clothes, saying, "Wash up, for heaven's sake." My clothing was discolored by the wine, which felt uncomfortable and icy against my skin. The indignity, disdain, and humiliation I was experiencing from their treatment of me all bubbled up inside of me and caused me to lose it. I turned to face the room after wiping my hands on my soiled shirt. I said, "I've been to a lawyer," in a steady, strong voice. "I'm going through a divorce." The room grew quiet. With ghostly eyes, Lucas and his mother gazed at me. Stepping forward, my mother-in-law growled, "Who do you think you are? You believe you can simply—" "I'm not done," I interrupted, my voice crystal clear. "I am contesting the store's merger. I've already forwarded the relevant paperwork to the authorities in the court since there has been fraud." Lucas faltered a little, his prior arrogance vanishing. "Roberta, this is not what you mean." I ignored his incredulity and said, "I am also seeking financial compensation for everything I've endured here." There was a tangible shock. As the guests began to process my declaration, murmurs began to build. I didn't wait for additional inquiries or for things to get worse. I pivoted and made my way upstairs to gather my belongings. My mother-in-law trailed after, her voice becoming desperate. "Please, Roberta, let's discuss this." "You are exaggerating." I came to a halt, spun around, and gave her one more look. I gave her the lawyer's business card without saying anything. I firmly said, "From now on, any communication goes through my lawyer." After that, my hand trembling but my determination unwavering, I made my way to our room. I packed fast, taking only what I would need to get started. I eventually moved into a little apartment across town from my mother-in-law's home. It was like if I was breathing clean air for the first time in a long time. Even though I was alone myself now, I wasn't. Together, my dad and I were striving to reclaim what was properly ours. Mr. Hayes, my attorney, put forth a lot of effort into our case. In the courtroom, he was a bulldog, fighting against the years-old fraudulent merger that my mother-in-law had planned. Before long, we got the news we had been waiting for. The court decided in our advantage. Mrs. Wilson was found guilty of fraud, and the merger was reversed. They also gave me monetary compensation and fined her a significant amount. The money was just enough to buy out her stake in the company, which my dad and I used to own together as a combination bakery and tableware store. It was strange to be back in complete control of the business, without Mrs. Wilson's shadow hanging over us as we stood in front of it. "We succeeded, Dad. It's back on ours," I declared, passing him the new store keys. Over the following few weeks, we renovated the store and gave it a new lease on life. Rearranging displays and applying fresh paint to walls was like regaining a lost aspect of my spirit. Mrs. Wilson and Lucas had to take work elsewhere. All of their savings were gone due to court fees and fines. I stayed away from them despite hearing reports about their difficulties. Lucas made a few attempts to get in touch, but I didn't answer. I had closed off that area of my life. Now my attention was on the future. I went back to college when we took ownership of the store. With the intention of completing my degree, I signed up for night classes. I felt hopeful sitting in a classroom once more, which was a far cry from the hopelessness I had experienced under Mrs. Wilson's roof. My dad and I shared a pot of coffee at one of the tables one evening after the shop closed. Glancing around the business with nostalgia, Dad added, "You know, Roberta, starting over like this, it's more than I could have asked for." "Dad, I feel the same way." Like I've finally awakened from an extended, horrible dream, I responded with a strength I hadn't felt in years. "We have a second chance here, and I'm not going to waste it." We discussed our future goals, including potential new product launches, holiday sales to be ready for, and potential sponsorships of local events. It was thrilling and energizing, and I thoroughly enjoyed every second of it.